I'm Nick, and this is a 16.8 litre small form factor MATX case. This is the Shiny Snake G300, and I've got to be honest with you guys right from the jump, it's about $89 US, and this has to be one of the most awesomely frustrating cases I've ever built with. Let's take a closer look. Here it is, the Shiny Snake G300. The case is a small form factor MATX case coming in at around about 16.8 litres. It's 345 millimeters deep, 180 millimeters wide, and 260 millimeters tall. Because of the design of this case, getting inside can be tricky or it can be easy. To get the side panel off, there are two screws. You need to remove those screws and then you slide the panel backwards and it unlatches, and then you can lift that away from the case. To get the rear panel off is the same deal. There's two more screws that you need to loosen and you slide it and you can pop that rear panel away from the case. There's a power supply bracket with the case as well. You need to remove 4 screws. There's 2 at the top and 2 on the side towards the front of the case. And once you remove those screws, you can pull that bracket away from the case. This will make your life a bit easier a little bit later on. The next part is technically optional, but I would recommend doing this. You want to remove the top and front shell of the case. It's a single piece. There's 2 screws at the rear of the case which need to come out. Then there's 4 screws along the backside top edge of the case which need to be removed as well. There's 2 more screws towards the front of the case which also need to be removed. Then you need to flip the case over. There's 2 screws at the front of the case. As you can see, guys, there's lots of screws to get the top and the front single piece off. There's a single screw at the back of the case to help remove the I/O. There's another screw towards the front of the case to remove the I/O. And once you've removed those 2 screws, that whole panel, including all the wiring, can be slid backwards and popped and then lifted away from the case. Finally, underneath the side I/O, there's 2 more screws. Once you loosen those screws and remove them, you can then pull the whole top shell of the case away from the chassis and the frame. You will also notice that this case has a handle on top. Unlike other cases that we've seen in the past, the Shiny Snake G300 has a reinforced handle, so the entire weight of the case can be supported with this handle, and it makes it easier for transporting because technically it is a small form factor case and you'll want to move it around sometimes. As for the I/O, there's a combined headphone and microphone jack, a USB Type-C port, 2 USB 3.2 ports, 2 USB 2.0 ports, and then there's a power button with a combined power light. As for the wiring, there's a single block for the front panel header, there's a USB 2.0 cable, there's the front panel audio cable, there's a USB Type-C cable, and a USB Type-A cable. As for motherboard support, as mentioned, the Shiny Snake G300 supports ITX and MATX motherboards. One thing to keep in mind with this case, much like all the other MATX cases in this size and form factor, you will probably want to use a motherboard with the PCIe slot in the first position. You'll also notice that the cooler and the RAM that I used for the final build is not the same as what you're seeing here because of the cooler just being slightly too large and touching the top of the graphics card that I would eventually use in this build. You have to remember, guys, I build it and film it as I go, and I take notes so I can show you guys what the deal is. As for the maximum cooler height, the G300 supports air coolers up to 164 millimeters tall, and already you can see that I changed the cooler to this little Noctua cooler here. As for fan and radiator support on the bottom, you can install 2 120 millimeter fans, and as you can see here in the build, I used 2 black Noctua Chromax fans. I realized this much later that you can't see these fans once the I/O cover is put back on. On the sample that we received from Shiny Snake, we didn't get these side brackets, but if you do have them, it will allow you to install a 240 or 280 millimeter liquid cooler on the side of the case, but you will need to use an SFX or SFXL power supply. There's also a single fan mount on the rear of the case for a 120 millimeter fan. here's where the case gets interesting, and possibly, depending on your GPU, why you won't need to remove the top and front shell, because this section of the case where the PCIe slot covers are can be completely removed, and it makes it a lot easier for GPU installation. As for GPU support, the maximum supported length is 340 millimeters. Now, sometimes I like to push my luck with GPUs that are maybe 1 or 2 mil larger, but it is honestly 340 mil. That is the magic number here. I tried to install this Aorus 5070 Ti and it just didn't fit. So I had to go with a smaller card, which to be honest is about 3 mil shorter, and this card fit in with no problems whatsoever. It's also worth mentioning there's an integrated power cable for the power supply, because the power supply is mounted at the front of the case, and there's a power connector on the back of the case because that runs through the entire inside of the case. As for power supply support, as already mentioned, it will support SFX and SFXL power supplies. You will need to bring your own bracket for that. However, if you wanted to use an ATX power supply, it is possible. Keep in mind that if the power supply is too wide, you'll encounter one of the next problems, and that is cable management. The cable management in the Shiny Snake G300 with an ATX power supply is an absolute nightmare. However, on the flip side of that, once you put the side panel on because there's a bit of a gap, look what happens. It goes on with no problem whatsoever. So, some of the things that annoy me about this case are actually really not as bad as I thought they would be, and it's portable. All right, let's take a look at the thermals with the Shiny Snake G300. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the thermals are rather quite good. There is a couple reasons for it. First of all, I put intake fans on the bottom of the case. I also flipped the CPU fan around and the rear fan to intake as well with some thermal results here, and you can see that the thermal results are within a margin of error and it's completely negligible. There will be people talking about installing the rear fan as intake, and as I've shown here, it makes almost no difference to the thermals whatsoever. So if you don't want to waste your time doing that, don't do that. It's completely up to you guys. If you like that vibe, then go for that vibe. All right. If you're interested in any of the parts in this build, there's little cards when I'm talking about those parts through those sections of the video, as well as a PC part picker list and some Amazon links down below that help support the channel. That's how we pay the bills and stuff, so yeah. Anyway, let's talk about the Shiny Snake G300. Yeah, the quality of the material is really, really good. I would compare this to somewhere between Lianli and Deepcool in terms of the quality itself. And to be honest, the case is really, really good and I like it, except for about 40 things, right? And this is kind of one of those things with a big disclaimer, because you have to remember this is an MATX case that is smaller than most ITX small form factor cases, right? Just keep that in mind. 16.8 liters. Because it's that small, it makes it insanely frustrating to build an MATX system in. So first of all, installing the GPU is rather easy, and as I showed, you can remove that plate on the side of the case to slide the GPU in really nicely, and that is a nice to have. However, I feel like there was a little bit of a missed opportunity, because to take off the front of the case requires you to remove about 10 screws, and you have to take the whole top and front shell of the case away to make it super accessible. Now, that said, the GPU clearance is only 340 millimeters as it is, so you're quite limited for massive GPUs. The original GPU that I was going to install here, I think from memory it's like 342, and sometimes you can get away with it, but I gotta be honest, as she says, every millimeter counts, and it really does count here. The GPU that I ended up using was bang on with the measurement, and anything larger than that, it just wouldn't fit and it just wouldn't feel good. It's very hard to keep a straight face when I say stuff like that. As well as that, the cooler that I originally decided to use was that Valkyrie cooler that you probably saw somewhere in the video. The reason why I didn't use it, and I probably talked about this already, is it actually sits too far down and it blocks the GPU going in at a nice angle. It would have been a pain in the ass to try and get that cooler to work. It's not the cooler's fault. It's actually kind of to do with the motherboard, and it's also not the motherboard's fault, because when you want an MATX board, you want that first PCIe slot to be in the first position. And I know there will be lots of complaints about boards that won't be compatible with this, with massive GPUs, because there are a lot of motherboards that we see that have that top PCIe slot in the second position. So as I've talked about in many other small form factor case videos and case reviews, you really need to be aware of where that first slot sits. Now, ASRock has done a second slot type of board for a long time. MSI has second slot boards, but this MSI board in particular, the reason why I chose it was because the top slot is in the first position. Now, it won't matter if you're using a 2-slot or a 3-slot card, but if you're using a massive 4-slot card, and also if you're using a 2-slot card and you want to put fans underneath the card, then it's very, very important that you pay attention to the board that you want to put in here. If you have a motherboard with the top slot in the second position and a 3 or 4-slot card and you want to use fans at the bottom, you're shit out of luck. It's just not going to work. Especially if you're using a 4-slot card in any other board, it's just not going to work anyway. The thing is with this case, depending on your hardware, you don't necessarily need to take the entire top and front shell of the case off. I did that because when we review cases, it's good to show the versatility of the chassis itself, and the fact that you can remove that and it's not all riveted together is really nice. To be honest, all of this case is screwed together and there's no rivets, so if you wanted to strip it down even further, you could, which is very, very nice. The main issue that I have with that is there's just so many screws to do the simplest thing in this case. This is one of the complaints I had with the last deep cool small form factor case that we checked out. It drove me mad because I remember, I think it was 17 screws to get into that case. This one's easy, it's only got 2 screws per panel, and then optionally you can remove that side IO and whatnot. You don't have to do it, but I would recommend making it as easy as possible, because then you have the path of least resistance when you're building in the G300. The major issue that I have with this case isn't even the fact that I have to pull the top and the front off. It's not even the fact that it is kind of frustrating and not everything's going to be compatible. It's more about the cable management situation here. Okay, I could have just as easily have used an SFX power supply, but you guys know how this goes. SFX power supplies are inherently more expensive than ATX power supplies, and when you're building with this case, there are 2 factors that come into play. First of all, your power supply needs to not exceed the width of the case when it comes to an ATX power supply. Not only that, you still need to leave clearance for the cables on the backside. However, even if you have enough clearance, there is no guarantee that all your cables will fit back there anyway, because from my measurement, it's about 12 to 14 millimeters of clearance when all the cables are plugged in. So you need to be very, very careful that your power supply is not just a tad too big. The other thing that I thought was a little bit strange with our sample at least is it didn't include the radiator brackets that you can use for this, because typically you can install either a 240 or 280mm liquid cooler on the side, which personally, if I was using this case, that's what I would be doing. But air cooling is also perfectly adequate. Even with this air cooler not being the biggest one, I think the thermals are pretty good. Now I'm running around in circles. I think the main thing that draws people towards a case like this, and it sounds ridiculous, but it's the handle, because this handle, unlike other cases that we've seen, is reinforced and is at the carry-on luggage size. So if you wanted to take your PC on the plane, this case kind of has a nice handle that looks like luggage, so you won't have a problem transporting this PC. To be honest, as much as this case frustrated me, I would go as far as saying that I would put all of those frustrations aside because I like this case. It's one of those things, like it drove me mad, and there could have been a couple better design choices, but man, you have to make some sacrifices. It is a 16.8 litre MATX case, and inherently when it comes to small form factor, you're going to have to make some sacrifices, and I think the sacrifices here are justified, especially when the Shiny Snake G300 is going for $89 US. Yeah, it's a yes from me. Claire thought it was going to go a completely different way because of how frustrated I was getting, but when I really think about it, I don't care about all the frustration, because once it's built, it's unlikely you're going to be pulling it apart anytime soon. And the fact that it's the size of, like, maybe a little bit bigger than most other ITX small form factor cases, and it's got an MATX board in it, which can open up a lot of different possibilities. One of those being that if you have a motherboard, I know I'm going back to motherboards, that has the top slot in the first position, you could put a 10 gig network card underneath it if the motherboard has another PCIe slot, or you could put a capture card underneath it. So you do have lots of options with a case of this form factor. This case is way smaller than a lot of other cases, and it's punching well above its weight. But if you're new to PC building, maybe not the case for you, because it will be very frustrating. But if you're a seasoned small form factor enthusiast, I don't think you're going to have a problem with this case whatsoever. But once again, I really wish I had the chance to do a liquid cooled build. I'm not sure why the brackets were not included. Let us know your thoughts. Or don't. I like it. I actually really like it. It's really cool.